Right, so welcome to the Change webinar on calculating the ROI of change management. As I said earlier, do be sure to use the chat function. We will be using it, as well as have a browser tab open. But enough from me. I'm sure we're all here to discover the various insights that Tom Marcicano will have for us as he leads us through the ROI of change management. Tom, how are you doing today?
Okay, so here's the agenda for today. We start with a very brief recap as a context and then address what is the return on investment of change management. This is a question that many practitioners have faced at one time or the other. It is an interesting challenge, but perhaps it's the wrong question. Is it possible that we can reframe the question and in so doing, create an even more compelling case for the value and the return of managing the people side of change? From what is the ROI of change management to what is the expected project benefits and how much of these expected benefits depends on the people side of change. So why is change management important? Well, the goal of change management, of course, is to capture or create the portion of the project benefits that depends on people adopting the change and using the new way of doing things, behaving differently. But it can only take place by individuals changing. While we can think of the whole organization like that, it's really individuals who are changing. So there's many people in the organization who are in their current state and they will transition through to the future state of the change, right? So if it's all about individuals, how does an individual change? And, would you ever guess that I would do one of these without talking about ADKAR? Of course. We're talking about the 5 building blocks for successful change. What do we have to build in someone if we would like them to change? And as many of you already know, if you want to build somebody up to change, you're going to have to build 5 elements in them. The first one's the awareness of the need for them to change. They need to be aware that they're going to change. And they need to know why. And they need to know what's going to happen if they don't change. Then we have to build the desire in them to participate in the change, to come along with the change, to adopt it. It's about motivation. It's about motivating them to, and them motivating themselves to come along with the change. Then, of course, they need to know what to do. And that's the knowledge. They have to build the knowledge of what to do differently, how to behave differently, what to say differently. And once they know that, they're going to have to start doing it. And that's what we mean by ability. Ability is actually demonstrating that they can actually do what needs to be done. All of this, of course, needs to be reinforced. So we need to reinforce the change so that once the person has changed, they stay changed. They don't go back to their old habits or forget about it and do something else. So we've got to build these 5 building blocks in people if we want them to change. So let's take the individuals who change and consider how this relates to a project that involves change. And when we're doing that, we'll see that, in any project of change, there is a technical side of the change, which is all about designing, developing, delivering, installing, or as Darryl Connor says, it's the installation part of the change. It's actually putting the change into place. And it could be, restacking the office as a result of the pandemic and the after effects of that. Or it could be a new system or a new procedure. It could be all sorts of different things that need to be designed, developed, and installed. Then there's the people side of the change, which is about the people who need to embrace, adopt, use this new way of doing things, and they need to deliver that too. And that's the realization of the change. And we need both of these elements to help take the organization from the current, where it is now, to the future that's going to look different because of this change. And when we do this, that's when we start to get results, outcomes, and ultimately success. So the return on investment of change management is really contained in the return on investment of the project, because the result of applying change management is the achievement of the intended results and the outcomes for the project. So while this is a bit of an overview of what change management is and how it differs from project management, we must not lose sight of one really extremely important fact, that there are human factors that drive the financial or other returns from the change we're making. What are those human factors? Well, there's three of them. The first one we call speed of adoption. And speed of adoption really is about how quickly are people up and running on the new systems, the new processes, the new job roles. And we talk about this adoption in terms of not doing it, but it's actually adopting the idea of it. It's kind of like saying, okay, I understand what it is you want me to do differently, and I'm okay to move forward. I may not be ready for it now. I may not know what to do yet, but I want to move forward. I do want to change. Then we talk about ultimate utilization, which is really about how many employees, how many people of the total population that has to change are actually demonstrating buy-in for the change and are using the new solution. So this is actually doing it. They've bought into doing it, but now they're doing it. That's utilization. And ultimate utilization is how many of these out of the total population. And the third element, the third human factor, we call proficiency, which is about how well are individuals performing compared to the level expected in the design of the change. So how well are we doing this? Yeah, I'm doing it, but am I really doing it as well as we all expected I should be doing it? So now for each of these human factors, we have an expected outcome, and that could differ from the actual outcome. Let's talk about this for a moment. Let's look at each of these in turn. So let's consider speed of adoption. What's the expected adoption? What's the baseline, if you like? And that very often is based on some sort of explicit or maybe even implicit assumptions that we're making about the change. You know, we may be assuming, well, this is a really good change and everybody should really be keen to adopt it. And so we'll go ahead and we'll assume that the adoption will be instant, for example. You know, of course, the project implementation phases and the rollout of the project would, of course, determine the speed of adoption as well. How quickly are we bringing the knowledge or the information about the change could affect how quickly we expect people to start adopting the change. Of course, the actual situation may be quite different. How quickly people get on board could be affected by things like passive or even active resistance to the change. So they may not be adopting as quickly as we would assume them to be. And however, through effective communications and good project launch and good discipline, and of course, lots of other actions that we take in change management, we could achieve this adoption. And you know, other examples are sponsorship. Sponsorship could be quite effective at helping to bring people on board with the change. Coaching people could be effective too. So there could be a difference between the expected and the actual. The same applies with ultimate utilization, because here there could be another set of assumptions in terms of, well, you know, we expect that everybody is going to come on board with this change. You know, we're going to switch off the old system and turn on the new one. So of course, we're going to go from 0 to 100%. But I think we all know that it doesn't always work like that. We may have done some sort of scenario analysis, but there is an expectation of participation. But what we sometimes have to take into account is that people may opt out of the new way of doing things. I mean, if you look at research, the biggest cause of resistance is disengagement. People not actually even engaging with the change or not even engaging with the organization. And because of that, they may not be utilizing this change as quickly as we want, or maybe not all of them are coming on board. And of course, this could result in any breakdown of those elements of ADCAR. Any of this could affect that. Reinforcement and resistance management, of course, will be very useful to bring the ultimate utilization up to where we want it to be. The third factor, proficiency, also has this kind of expected and actual, because here the expected is assumed that, you know, once we've put this thing in, there's going to be ongoing improvement from the solution. We may be doing Six Sigma or some other kind of continuous improvement programs here, agile, whatever. And it's assumed that we're going to continue to improve. And it comes as a result of these new processes and interactions with technology and behaviors and so on. But what may actually happen is that it's really determined by the competence of everyone who is doing their job in the new way. So it depends on individuals and how well they're doing it. Also, it can be reduced as a result of resistance. So resistance can always get in the way of this, and we don't get people being as effective or as efficient even at doing what they should be doing. So how well we achieve these three human factors does have a direct impact on how well we're going to meet the project objectives. And I think, again, a lot of you will recognize this particular piece of research where, you know, they were asking people, depending on how effective your change management is, how is this contributing to meeting or exceeding the project objectives? And we can see that there's a big difference from doing change management poorly, resulting in about 15% of projects that are meeting or exceeding their objectives, all the way to when we're doing change management really well, excellently, we're going to 93% of projects that are meeting or exceeding their objectives. So there is this strong relationship, and it's been like this for 20 years that ProSci has been researching change management. It also, of course, includes we're also thinking in terms of the return on investment that comes out of this, of course, that's going to affect the return on investment. Another way of looking at this, you can see in this graphic over here, what we're trying to understand here is that changes that have no people change component to them. So if we're making a change where we're really not relying a lot on people to adopt new ways or do new things, maybe we're resurfacing a debt or something like that, there isn't much change for people in that. That sort of change would have a high certainty of achieving that return on investment. But as we depend more and more on people adopting the change, the certainty of achieving that, it reduces, and it can reduce quite dramatically. So there could be a difference here between the actual and the expected return on investment. And of course, effective change management would then have the effect of bringing that graph up, bringing that line up, so that we can decrease the uncertainty associated with changes that impact how people do their jobs. So, and this, of course, would lead to improving the return on investment of the projects that impact people. And so this is, you know, potentially another way of looking at it. The correlation here, so, you know, understanding the expected benefits of a project, you can begin to assess the project dependency on these three human factors and help determine the likelihood of achieving that expected return, could be financial or others. Each human factor will impact the benefits realized. With no change management, the likelihood of achieving ultimate utilization, speed of adoption, and proficiency could be a lot lower than we expected it to be. And we have another way of depicting that as a potential way of understanding how these human factors affect the return. And I'm looking at here a case of let's say a hypothetical change. It could be a new sales procedure, maybe a new way of selling or a new way of providing service to customers. In the initial part of that project, of course, we're investing time and money and so on. So there's a negative cash flow. And then you can see the expectation is that after we go live and a short period after that, we are going to be getting a better return, and we're going to start to see that return on investment. So how could we depict, and how does the speed of adoption, utilization, and proficiency find their way into this kind of depiction of return? Well, your speed of adoption really is about that slope, the slope of that curve of how quickly people are adopting the change, coming on board, and then finally going to be using it. And of course, the ultimate utilization is about the measurement of that final bar. In that final bar over there, if everyone is on board, we should expect to get that return. If only half the people have come on board, how could we expect to make 100% of the benefit? Proficiency, of course, is going to drive the height of the bars along the way, the return as we go along, because the proficiency of people is affecting that efficiency. And if they're not efficient, we may be having to do some what we call the expensive retrain, redo it, and so on. So these human factors find their way into something as material and as real as a cash flow for a particular change. Of course, what we have been saying earlier, the results could be different to this. Okay, we could end up with a different kind of flow because we didn't get one or more of those three factors to come to fruition as quickly as we thought it would, or as well as we thought it would. So bringing all the components together that we've spoken about over the months, if you like. Now, you know, we said that building ADCAR was important and it's essential for people to change. And people, of course, are instrumental in delivering the results. But what actions build ADCAR? Again, another slide I think some of you have seen quite often, but I want to put a different spin on it here. So here's a mapping, and you can see we've got the elements of ADCAR across the top, and we've got the 5 key action sets that would build the elements of ADCAR. And for example, you'll see communications, very good for building awareness and for reinforcing the change, does contribute to the other elements as well. Sponsorship, very good for awareness, desire, and reinforcement. And so we go. Coaching is, of course, what middle managers are doing, what the first line managers are doing. And these action sets will all end up building ADCAR. But what I've done now is I've gone and overlaid the human factors on this so that we can see when these are delivered in the process. And you'll see that that speed of adoption is typically delivered when we're building the awareness and the desire. The ultimate utilization, we start to get the utilization towards the end of desire building, but it's about building the knowledge and then starting to use it. And of course, ability is when we're really going to start building that proficiency. So we brought them all together in this one graphic, and we can see how they all link to each other. So this investment in action ultimately delivers benefit. It delivers the ROI. It delivers that return. But we need to be careful how we express this. Because, you know, are we talking about the change management return on investment as something on its own, something separate? Or is it part of the project return on investment? And it's important for us to phrase this correctly. So the change management return on investment, we could say, is the expected percentage of the project benefits that are directly tied to employees adopting and using the change and becoming proficient at it. The change management's value is delivering that portion of the benefits. It's the people dependent part of the overall results that change management would be delivering. So let me ask you this. Let's get your input on this one. What I'd like you to do is, now we can go to the Menti. Okay, you go to menti.com, as Nicholas was advising at the beginning. So open a tab in your browser, menti.com, and when you get there, you will be asked this question that you see now. Okay, what percentage of your current big change is directly dependent on adoption, utilization, and proficiency? So why don't we answer that? Let's see for this audience over here, because we've done this measurement with other audiences, but I'd like to see for the people in the room today. 83%. Okay. All right. Chat them in. What percentage? 75%. Cool. 90%. Wow. 100%. And it seems like 100. Okay. 70% is quite popular. Here we go. You know, I'm not seeing 10s and 20s here. Yeah. The lowest I'm seeing is 65. What are we really saying here? Most of the value that we're going to be getting is dependent on this adoption, utilization, and proficiency. You know, this is very typical. We could show you studies, many of them at various conferences, at various points in time, where people are coming back. And this is so common that most of the changes we are making have a very high dependency on this adoption, utilization, and proficiency. Now, think about how many changes are going on right now in your organization. How many changes are going on right now in your organization? Are we, do we have Project Alpha, Beta, so, and how many of these changes are going on? For each one of these changes, you could do this analysis. And you would start to give you a feeling for what kind of capability your organization may need, to embrace all of this change together. Now, this whole topic of building the capability in the organization to deal with multiple simultaneous changes is a topic of interest for a number of people. And later on, towards the end of this session we got today, I'm going to ask you to vote in what you would like us to chat about in future webinars. And this, of course, if this is a topic of interest, then let's talk about the portfolio of change, or trying to build a change capability in the organization to deal with all these kinds of changes that are going on. But let's stay on topic. Let's get back to the topic. Let's understand the process we need to follow to get us to the ROI answers. So I'm going to take you through the process here. And it's a fairly straightforward process. It's supported by a pretty nice tool. And that will take you to the point where you can express that return on investment for all this work that we're going to do in change management. So I'd like you to think about, and you can start making some notes here. I'd like you to think about a project that you're currently supporting, something you're busy with right now. And we're going to start with the bottom line up front. So we start with the bottom line. Think about a project you're currently supporting. Identify what are the results and the outcomes. What are we expecting to get? What is expected from this project or initiative? And then answer the question, what percentage of those results and outcomes are dependent on individuals doing their jobs in a new way? Okay, it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier, anywhere from 65 to 100. And then the next step in the process is identify these definitions. Try to set up some definitions of what we mean by speed of adoption. What does it mean to actually adopt the idea of this change? What would people need to be saying or doing that would tell us that they have adopted the change? What about ultimate utilization? How many people need to change? What would that utilization look like? Is it executing a new process? Let's start to get a little bit specific here. And let's also start to get specific about the proficiency. What are we wanting? Do we want everyone to be 98% efficient, or is 95 okay? Let's start to define what we mean by these three human factors. And there may be some, of course, specific assumptions that we're making as we go along. Let's note those assumptions, because that becomes part of that discussion and part of that presentation, if you like, of the return on investment on the change management that we're going to be doing. So with this, we can then, construct this kind of a table where we would say, okay, look, for the speed of adoption, maybe we're expecting in X weeks or X months for people to start saying, all right, great, I'm ready to change. I don't know what to do yet, but I'm good to go. I want to come along with it. And maybe there could be some either percentage for ultimate utilization, percentage of the total population. Maybe there's 100 people who need to change, but we'll be satisfied for this release to go with 85%. What is that number that we're looking at? Could be a real number, could be an actual number, or could be a percentage. And then, of course, what's the proficiency? How well should they be doing this? Could also be expressed as a percentage of the 100 transactions that go through that the people in the call center are going to process. We're expecting 95% of them to be correct first time, something like that. We need to get that specific, because when we get that specific, then what you can really say is that the resulting return on investment is a function of actually achieving these human factors. And we're linking these three factors in a simple statement of the return of investment as a function of these factors. Always remember, though, please, that we're not forgetting the non-financial elements here. I'm not excluding them. Even those, of course, can be quantified. For example, customer satisfaction. Oh, well, we do a customer survey. We're currently at 8.95. And as a result of this change that we're doing with our customer relationship management system or process, we expect that they're going to really be much happier with our service, and that'll go to 9.13, something like that. You can put these into numbers, okay? We should try to do that. It doesn't have to be the dollars, euros, and rands, but it can certainly be some sort of number that we put to it. So having established this basis for defining the return on investment for a change, let's consider how this could be calculated. So in very plain, simple, if you like, principle terms here, the project's return on investment could be described by this formula. Well, it's the expected project benefits minus, of course, the costs of doing this divided by the project costs. Okay, and that would give us the return on investment from the project perspective. Remember that a part of the project costs is the cost of doing change management. And we're going to come to that later. We're not going to ignore that. We're certainly going to come to that later. So if we look at those, at the expected project benefits, some benefits are dependent on the adoption and the usage, and some are independent of that. So it's useful to identify that and those differences. And we can see, a change independent of adoption and usage is a very small dependency on adoption and usage. Or there could be another change that we're making that's highly dependent on the adoption and usage. And it's good for us to be able to understand that and state that up front. Well, what are we looking at? So to make this real, let's look at an example just to clarify what I mean here. So in this example, we have two projects. And maybe the project one is about restacking the office, as a result of the pandemic and the number of people that are now working from home, which is much higher than before. The way we're organizing our teams, we had a lovely community session on activating our change agents the other day. As a result of all of that, we've decided we're going to restack the office, and that's going to cost $2 million. Okay. We've also got another project, which is about optimizing a bunch of processes in a particular operational area, and that's also going to be costing $2 million. So we've got these two projects, and that's the expected benefit of those projects, right? Now we ask the key question. If the adoption and the utilization is zero, if nobody comes on board, how much benefit would we still derive out of making this investment, out of making this change? And now we start to see some difference. In the office restacking, we're saving space, we're optimizing the way we're doing things. There could be quite a lot of benefit in that just by doing that, okay? $1.5 million of that $2 million. Whereas in the case of optimized processes, it's all about people running those processes. We can design the best processes, but if people don't run them, so what? Okay, so you could see there's if the utilization is the adoption, the utilization is zero. It's a very low. It's a relatively smaller percentage. So the people side benefit coefficient is quite different between these two projects. Now, ProSite's got a tool they call the Change Management ROI calculator that helps us analyze multiple projects in this way from a sort of return on investment perspective. And it's this kind of calculation that we start off doing in this tool. I'm going to step you through the process that it automates for you. And if you're interested in this tool, just chat in your email address into the chat box, and Nicholas will pick that up and he'll send you some information on this so that you can get to see more about this. So how does it begin? So you chat in. Let's go through it. So how does it begin? We start with some basic project data, okay, like the expected project financial benefit, for example. Then we start asking this kind of question: what if the adoption and the utilization is zero? How does that affect that benefit? And we plug this into a model that this will build, which will allow us to do even some sensitivity analysis. So, yes, it'll give us the straightforward answer, But there's some other questions that we could be asking and should be asking about this. How sensitive is this to various variables? And there's a couple of variables that I'm listing over here that we could actually plug into the tool. Like, for example, the adoption and usage. Yeah, okay, so if it was 0, yeah, but what about if it wasn't 0? What about if it was 20%? How would that look in terms of the return? What is the resulting project benefits? What's the resulting ROI from that? Or we could flex the variable of the project benefits amount. So, what is the minimum amount of benefit we are prepared to live with? Given that minimum amount, what is the required adoption and usage? That's pretty useful, because that now we can start setting some minimum targets or some benchmarks, if you want to call it that. We could use that, play it that way. Or we could say, hang on, we've got a minimum ROI needed for all projects we run in this organization. It's like the cost of capital kind of number. We won't go with something that's less than 20% ROI. Well, okay, so if I plug that in, what's the required adoption and usage then? And what's the resulting project benefits that we're looking for? And we start to do this kind of sensitivity calculations. And the tool will graph this out for you. And I'm just going to throw up 1 or 2 examples of the kinds of stuff that it produces. And, the graph will show the sensitivity. You can see that, on that line graph, the 0 to 100%, that's of course the adoption and utilization, and it's going from the minimum to the maximum sort of thing. So you get the expected adoption and usage with no change management, because you'll always get some benefits possibly out of this particular change. We can also enter some scenario adoption and usage, and it'll then generate for you the ROI. You start to see some of those graphs over there. And the cost for change management itself in the scenario would generate, if you plug that in, it'll generate the change management return on investment. So in summary, in the tool, you can add an unlimited number of projects. So you can do this not just for one, for a whole, just keep going, an unlimited number into this calculator. You can choose from either a project with a single benefit outcome to ones with multiple. And there's an example there where I've got one where, we're saving costs, but we're also wanting to increase revenue, both of those. So that's an example of a multiple benefit type of project. And we can generate calculations in multiple currencies too, if that's, for some people who are in the multinationals, that could be quite important. And we could, of course, perform some optional scenario analysis and calculate the ROIs based on those. So this tool allows us to actually generate this output and do this sensitivity analysis. So in leading up to presenting the case for investing in change management, we start by showing the investment proposed that will result in the ROI for the project, and then for that investment in getting the adoption and utilization that we're looking for. So what value lies in adoption and utilization? And I keep saying adoption and utilization, but of course proficiency is always on the end of that as well. And how much we will invest in obtaining that adoption and utilization. It's not for free. We have to invest. We have to do things to get that adoption and utilization. So in the graphic here, the segment on the left is the benefit, and the one on the right in the deep blue is what we are currently investing to achieve that assumed or targeted adoption and utilization. And of course, that may be a little unrealistic. We're going to get like, 60, 70% of the benefit of the project by investing just, 5% of the total. That may be a little bit unrealistic. We may need a little more to assure that adoption and utilization. And this is the kind of conversation that we could get into, and we could justify that. So possibly to assure the adoption and the utilization, we may need to make a little bit higher investment in building the adoption and utilization by, of course, doing change management activities. So let's wrap that back now. Go back to the chart that we delivered, that we developed earlier. What does this really mean? It means that you can now say, well, to what we really should be doing is doing those actions that will generate the change in people. So in the case of communications, we're going to be spending so much money. We're going to be asking you to spend so much time going around as a leader, talking to your people about the change. The sponsors, we know how important, the research is so clear about how important sponsorship is. Well, dear sponsor, we're asking you to spend this amount of time with your people, communicating to them and explaining the importance of this change, because that is what's going to contribute towards that adoption and utilization that forms 70% of the benefit that we wanted to get out of the project, and so on. What would the frontline, the first line managers, the supervisors, how much time and effort, and how are we going to support them? What tools are we going to give to them? There may be some costs involved in that. What training are we going to give them and to help them coach their people through the change, for example? All these actions, which we know ultimately end up being what we call the change management plan, is now something you can link directly to the adoption and utilization, and therefore the benefits of the project. So we could do this for all action sets, and then that would constitute your ask in terms of the investment in change management. Now we've actually drawn that direct link between all the actions we're going to be taking and what result will they bring in terms of the benefit that the project is delivering. And of course, you've got the process, but you've also got the tools to support that and provide you the kind of numbers that you would be looking for. This is where you can show that detail of how we want to invest in these 5 key activity sets that make up change management. Of course, each area is going to have its own costs. Now that we've built this relationship, of course, now it's about communicating this. Even if this is a very logical approach, we still need to be able to describe this to our audience. And, this is where I'm reminded of a great leader and what he had to say about communicating, because this is, we've got all the numbers, we've got the graphs, we've got the tables, but now we need to communicate it. And I always go back to what Mandela said, you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. You talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. And we really need to get to the heart here. We need to get to, we need to connect with the people and how they're thinking about the change. So it's all about the words we use, right? And you and I, if we insist on talking about the sort of stuff that you and I as practitioners are going to be talking about, which is fine, we're going to be talking about communications and training and stakeholders and resistance and resilience. Yeah, all that kind of stuff is the meat and potatoes of what we do as change management, but it's really our stuff, right? And we could even go further and start dropping some acronyms like ADCAR and SUP and PCT and go on, and we just lose our audience, right? Then we get that glazed look in their eyes, and if we get that, we know we've lost them. So, if we're talking to the C-suite, we should be talking their language. There's nothing wrong about talking about communications and stakeholders and resistance, but that's for a different audience. So think about the audience you're going to be presenting this case for developing a return on investment from doing your change management work. And that may be this kind of language, like what is the return on investment of doing this? What kind of benefits are we realizing? To what degree? What sort of objectives are we driving towards? How are we going to sustain the value that we're delivering out of this change? So when we get to that, then we're starting to talk their language. And the C-suite wants to hear that, don't they? If you are presenting to them, that's the kinds of things that they're going to want to hear us say. So again, let me ask you to do a little bit of thinking here about the project that you're currently supporting, that you're working on. start to identify the specific words and phrases that you can start using and those that you would stop using when describing the people side impact of the value for your project. What is the sort of stuff they would be interested to hear and note from you? What are the ones you're going to try to avoid using with that particular audience? You may have multiple audiences. Well, in that case, you've got a table and you can start to, tabulate this and start to differentiate between who we are having this conversation with. And that's just how we can translate all of this change management ROI work that you do and I do, and all that we have discussed so far. We can translate that into those kinds of conversations. So we've completed the journey today, and I hope you can now see how everything we discussed over the past couple of months has helped us truly to get a handle on what we do in our change management, when we're doing our change management thing, and the value that it can generate for your projects. So with what we've discussed today, I think you can see now we're talking about how the value is generated in the process, and how do we generate this adoption, utilization, and proficiency, and how we build that into the conversation, and how we actually calculate that ROI on the people side of change, and ultimately how we're going to present this to our audience. But it does go beyond this too, You can now feel more confident about what you as a change manager are prepared to commit to from a value driver perspective. We can be very quick to ask leaders to go ahead and do stuff to help their people. But, if we're going to challenge our leaders to lead change, we should be challenging ourselves to deliver on the investment that we've asked them to make. So we're asking them to put the money in. We're asking them to put the time in. What are we prepared to commit to as change managers to deliver as a part of that benefit of the change itself? The discussion useful, and you've got some insight into a tool that you could use and the process that you could use to help build your return on investment. I'm going to open up for questions. So if you've got any questions, please chat them in. Nick is monitoring. And Nick, if you've got any questions, fire them off. Let's talk about somebody's question about the return on investment of change management.
I do have a question here. Assigning a rands and cents value to change management is often a challenge when change management is meant to be invisible. Do you have any comment on this?
That's a good question. Yes, and it's true that very often you want it to be sort of part of what we're doing. So the invisible part that I'm understanding there is, it's got to just feel like it's like what I do with my people. What do we do when we're coaching our people? How are we helping them adopt change? Yes, it's got to look invisible, but we should never just assume that it's going to happen because it's invisible. We should be consciously speaking with leaders about what they, and recommending what they should be doing with their people, and also recognizing that is going to cost, that's going to need a commitment on their part. It's costing them time. They're going to have to spend some money in doing the communications or the road show. So yes, the work's invisible, but the investment should be made visible. And if we make it visible, we can then link it to the benefits. And that gets us the support we need, because ultimately we need the support from the leaders. A great question. Thank you. Any others, Nick?
Yeah, a couple of other questions. Could you go through an example from your experience where this framework was successful in engaging the decision maker?
I remember once we did a culture change project. It was a really big project, involved over 30,000 people. And, culture is one of those things. We're changing the way people think about the about the work they do, the way they think about how they work as teams, how they provide service to customers. It's all about how I feel about the work I'm doing, what I think, how I express myself. Difficult one to get financial sort of numbers there, but we had to do a lot of work. But we did a lot of work in trying to translate what those behaviors would result in terms of customer satisfaction, in terms of error rates, or how people, how resilient could we make teams because they were teaming better. And we expressed that. I mean, the primary sponsor of that project was none other than the chairman of the board. And he wanted to have the numbers. He said, we're going to do all of this work. You're expecting us to spend, I'm going to spend time going around the country from venue to venue. What are we going to get for this? I know we need to change. I know we have to change. Our customers have told us we need to, but I need to be able to manage that. And if I can't measure it, I can't manage it. And that for me was a really good example of where we have to step up to the plate and offer those numbers, possibly even before they start asking for it, that we can show that, yeah, we're looking after the people side of change, but we're thinking business-like in the way we do things. Hope that kind of helps. So it was a really classic example for me.
Another question coming through. Could we apply some industry risk models when calculating ROI, thinking about people risks such as turnover?
Can we use some industry models, did you say? Some industry benchmarks?
Could we apply some insurance industry risk models when calculating ROI, thinking about people risk such as turnover?
Oh, yes, we could. We certainly could. It reminds me of, one client that we're working with is in that industry. And they used some models to help them work out how they'd actually started this project years ago, long before the pandemic, about helping people to work from home and sort of really take control of the way they're going to work. And I recall that they were using the same sort of thinking, the same thinking models to try to establish those targets on speed of adoption. So, what adoption rates are we assuming we're going to get from people? And the interesting thing about this particular one is that being a multinational, of course, it's different. As you go from location to location, the cultures are different. So, they started with a kind of model that said, well, more or less, this is how we expect everybody to adopt the change and use the change and start to become a little bit more flexible in the way they work, etc. But of course, when they went from location to location, they found that they had to tweak that model. But if you start with a model and you know what those variables are, then you can do something. When you find that the actual versus the benchmark, remember we were talking about it earlier? When that actuals are turning out differently, you can go back to those models. So you can use risk models. Absolutely. You can use risk models to establish some sort of risk profiles. And you could even do that on different communities within the organization that has to change. So, how would that look working from home? How would that look for an analyst? How would that look for the sales team? It could be quite different because, of course, they may need different support. And we would build those into the models, into the risk models. Yeah, that reminds me of an interesting case. In fact, in that
Another
industry.
question.
Yes, thanks, Nick.
This one I think is rather topical. Given current global affairs, what is the impact of virtual work on measuring the return on investment on change management?
I think that's a very good question, because I think what's happening, what I'm hearing from practitioners, two sort of categories of effect of that. The one is the effect on how we measure, because it gets quite challenging to actually understand how much effort people are putting into their work, because it's, to a certain extent, less visible. It's not a case of, well, I come to work, I'm at the office, and then I go home with the sort of assumption that, you know, more or less I do most of my work when I'm at work. That's not happening with the current sort of environment. So the measurements are becoming more challenging. We're working with one particular government client who's doing a really interesting project. They're working really hard, but it's a real challenge for them to stay in touch with their people and try to get a handle on how much effort is going into doing the communications and the coaching of their people. So that's the one area that's being affected. The second area that's being affected is the amount of work that it's taking. So what we're finding, or what I'm hearing from practitioners, they're telling me, you know, just to get the same outcome from a communications point of view actually requires more communications. It requires more frequency. It requires more flexibility in the leaders in terms of doing communications, for example. Training, to some extent, yeah, we're finding it in training too. This virtual training could actually take more time than it would on the face-to-face. So, you know, the costs are going up. It becomes really important for us to focus on that return on investment, because if we're seeing an uptake in costs to get people to adopt and use the change, we'd better make sure that we are staying focused, or we can focus minds on how much return we're getting on that. Those are the two big sort of feedbacks I'm getting from the impact of the world we're in right now. Great question. Thank you for that. Wonderful. Good. Thanks.
And I think last question,
Yes.
unless anybody else would, again, I'm going to open up the invite for anybody to leave their questions in the chat bar or in the Q&A section. But the last question I have here today for now is there a method to measure the ROI based on the ADKAR assessments of our employees?
Method to measure based on the ADKAR assessments.
I'm guessing that the question revolves around, instead of measuring the human factors, speed of adoption, ultimate utilization, and proficiency, measuring those in the context of ADKAR scores.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, remember the table we did? We wouldn't put those human factors on the top. So, you know, if you've got a method, if you've got a system that you've set up where you're getting ADKAR measures coming back, and I don't know, it could be the average awareness, the average, you know, per group, per whatever. If you've got that sort of system going, you know, you remember we've got we've got ADKAR over here. All right. And what did we say? We said speed of adoption was kind of in this space, and utilization was in that space over there, and proficiency was over there, right? So you start taking measures of these in groups, not only, you know, individuals, groups. You start taking these measures, those numbers that are coming out, which is your average ADKAR scores, okay, from those assessments. In a sense, they were implying what you can expect to be your adoption and your utilization. So you can start to get that to happen now. So you know, if you like, it's a proxy. So if you're struggling, or if you're already far down the project, and we didn't define these when we started out, these you can work with right now, and you can almost look upon these as a proxy for how your adoption, your utilization is going. So it's, you know, it's not like, oh, it's too late, we didn't do it now, I'll do it for the next project. No. What could be a good proxy that tells you people have adopted? You know, what we say to our practitioners: walk around and listen to what people are saying, because what people say can tell you a lot about where their heart is, where their minds are, and of course that translates itself ultimately into those ADKAR scores. Great, nice question too. Thanks. These have been great discussions. I want to thank you very much for the privilege you've given me, the opportunity you've given me. I always like to, you know, to end off with, you know, have many happy changes. As usual, of course, we'll publish a summary of this webinar together with the rest of our webinars in the next couple of days. And we plan to start another webinar series in a short while. And of course, we'll keep you posted. In the meantime, you can stay connected with us. by visiting our LinkedIn pages and our Facebook sites. And feel free to write to Nick. I'm showing you his email address there. You can write to Nick and write to me, Tom, at any time. We'd love to hear from you. And you've given us input as to what you would like to talk about in future webinars. And I'm inspired. I'm looking forward to building some of these again and sharing with you again, and look forward to seeing it at some of our community events. And many happy changes. I hope things go very well with you, and go well. Cheers for now.